Today, I am sharing 10 of my best tips for speeding up your editing workflow. So, I'm going to dive right into it. If you guys are not already, make sure to follow along and hit subscribe so that you hear about every single YouTube video that comes out every single Monday and every podcast episode as well. So, one of the first things that I have learned is that if you are not shooting something well in camera with the right type of lighting, it is going to be hard to edit quickly. My number one tip is to make sure that you are finding the best lighting scenarios as possible when you are shooting in camera and staying really mindful of the lighting in the background, the lighting on your subject, and any unwanted objects or things that are making it into your picture frame so that it is easier to edit later. Over time, I've also tried to remind myself and make sure that I'm shooting straight and horizontal as much as possible. My second tip for making your editing way faster is to make sure that you are shooting in the raw file format. So you want to make sure that your camera is switched to RAW instead of JPEG. RAW is a much larger file size, but it does give you a lot more control over the colors while you're editing in Lightroom or Photoshop after the fact. It's going to help you adjust your white balance a lot easier, contrast, like lights, darks, shadows, everything. You have so much more control over it, and it makes it so worth the extra file space on your hard drives. My next tip is to make sure that you are keeping your white balance as consistent as possible while you're shooting. So, say you're shooting in manual, which is great. You want to make sure that your settings are as consistent as possible. I also recommend that instead of using auto white balance, manually set your white balance. And there are two main ways that you can do this. You can either lock in the Kelvin number through your camera settings, or you can custom set your white balance using an Expo disc. I first started out with custom setting my white balance using an Expo disc. I did have to keep remembering as I would change location or if the lighting changed a lot, I would have to reset that. Over time, I've moved to just manually setting my white balance in Kelvin because I find that it's a little bit faster to do, especially on wedding days. And I can usually be able to look at what the lighting looks like and just set the Kelvin based off of experience. It's helpful to note that the numbers that you're seeing in Lightroom on the white balance, where it's like blue to yellow, those numbers are the same numbers as you're using for Kelvin in your actual camera. So, my recommendation is to always manually set your white balance using Kelvin. Another tip that isn't necessarily linked specifically to editing, but it's actually linked to exporting your images, is to make sure that you are organizing your files in a collections if you're doing it for weddings. And that way you can export four collections at a time or four different batches of photos at a time in Adobe Lightroom. And that way you don't have to export all of your wedding images of 1 through 1500 or something like that. You can do it in batches and chunks at a time. And so if you're following along on YouTube, I have a little screen that's up here that shows you exactly how I organize all of my images on my specific hard drives and within those different collections, like within each folder for each wedding. This way, you're just exporting your images at the end of the process, and it saves you a little bit of time. Another great tip that I have is to use Photo Mechanic to select the photos that you actually want to go ahead and edit. When you're taking photos, you probably have a couple of duplicates. You have photos where people are closing their eyes or a squirrel is running through the background of a photo. This process of choosing which images you're going to keep and edit for and deliver to your clients is called culling. And Photo Mechanic is really great because it allows you to view raw files really quickly and be able to choose which ones you want to keep. If you import all of your photos into Lightroom, it takes Lightroom a little bit of time to render and pull up what each image looks like because the raw file is so large. And so Photo Mechanic is a program that you can buy. I'll have it linked down in the description below, but it's a program that you just pay for one time and it saves you hours and hours of time and a ton of space as well. My second tip is to cull backwards through your sessions or your weddings, because chances are, if you're taking a set of images, your third or fourth photo is probably going to be closer to the best photo that you have than the first one, just because you're like adjusting things as you go. And so I always scroll backwards, and in Photo Mechanic, I hit T to tag the photo as one that I want to keep. My next tip is to edit in sections. So I recommend breaking your shoot or your weddings down into multiple sections so that it's less overwhelming to edit over 1,000 photos. I try to chunk them down into 100 to 200 images at a time because this allows me to stay super focused, super in the zone, and then take a break before I dive into the next set of images. And so I find that editing it in sections keeps me more motivated and excited to get through the entire gallery than trying to edit everything all in one sitting. My next tip is to edit your anchor images first. So rather than editing each image one at a time, I recommend one, making sure that you're shooting in manual and having that manual white balance like we talked about beforehand. But what you want to do is choose one or two images that are in like different locations throughout your shoot and edit those ones first. Those are going to be what are called your anchor images. And then from there, you can go and sync your edits from that one picture in a certain set or in a certain location. You can sync it across the board to all of the other images that are within that same lighting scenario and portrait location. This works really well if you can train yourself, again, like I mentioned, to have that manual white balance set up. And it super, super speeds up your imaging, it super speeds up your editing process, and it allows for your entire shoot to look really consistent because you're making sure that your anchor edits that are across all different parts of your shoot look really consistent before you go and sync them to the entire rest of your images. Another little nifty trick that I found in Lightroom is to use the feature that's called Match Total Exposure. So it lets you set a ton of images exposures to a target or an anchor photo, like we've talked about. And that way you can match the exposure to look about the same as the one that you chose. And it saves a ton of time of adjusting the exposure on each individual photo. It does a pretty good job of getting it very similar and consistent looking. Another tip that I really love and that saves me a ton of time with every single shoot that I edit is applying a preset on import. Chances are you're making a base set of tweaks to images over and over again. And so I recommend having your own individual preset that does most of those things for you as it's importing the images. So, for example, something that I always do to all of my images is increase the contrast to plus 15. So instead of going through and adjusting it to every single image to be plus 15, I will make sure that my base preset has that already built in so that it's applying it as it's importing all of my photos. So after my photos have imported, they already have my base preset applied and they look pretty close to usually what I need to get them to be. Usually I just have to adjust the white balance a little bit and the exposure a little bit, straight and crop. And that's the majority of the editing that I am doing to most of my images. So I hope these tips were helpful and help you speed up your own editing process. If you have any questions at all, feel free to drop them down below or shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'm at Manali Sentike, and I can't wait to see how this helps you in your photography business.